Okay, so I have some of my paint. Obviously, it's not all the colors that you guys have, but there's a couple things that are really important to know about oil paint before you even start working with it. So, as you guys have probably noticed, it's pretty thick. It's kind of like the consistency of toothpaste. So we are going to be diluting our paint. For the underpainting, we will be diluting it with water. And this is the only time that you will ever mix oil paint with water. Otherwise, we will always be using linseed oil, which you have in a little cup. And that's what we'll be using to dilute and then blend our colors. So when we get our paint started, we always mix our colors before we add any water or any oil. Now, you guys have a limited amount of paint. You can't get more, so be really careful with how much you're mixing. I tried to give you guys a lot. You'll have more than what you see here, just so that way you don't run out, but keep in mind that once you run out of a color, you will be out of that color. So be really careful when you're mixing. Think about your color wheel and what colors might need to go together. You might even want to practice mixing a really small amount of colors until you find a shade that you like before you commit, because if you are trying to make a light green and you use up all your yellow, then you are going to be stuck without that color. So be really careful mixing. Other important things to know about mixing oil paint is you always, always, always need to use either a palette knife or our popsicle sticks. You never mix colors with your brushes when they are thick like this, because it will completely ruin your brushes and it will not work. So you have to use the popsicle sticks. I gave you a few, so hopefully it's enough. Otherwise, maybe you can find something at home that will work. But never ever use your brushes unless you're mixing a teeny tiny amount and you are mixing with a little bit of linseed oil. But otherwise, always use this to mix your colors and mix them before you add any water or oil. I will probably say it a whole bunch of times because it is that important. So I'm going to mix a few colors for my background. As I said, I'm mixing 4 different colors. They do not need to be the perfect shade. This is just an underpainting. It's going to be a very thin layer of color. It will eventually mostly get covered up, so if the color is not quite right, it's okay. So for example, my pine trees, I'm just going to use this straight green color, even though it's not exactly the color that my pine trees will end up being at the end. It's close enough that it will work for the underpainting. Same thing for the light blue. I'm not going to change this color, even though my sky will probably be slightly different. I might mix in some white later on, especially if I want to do some clouds, but for the underpainting, the solid blue, the lighter of the 2 blues will be just fine. So what I'm going to do is mix a lighter green for my grassy area and then a shade of gray for my mountains. And again, it might not be the exact shade of gray that I'll use in the final version, but it will be enough to just provide that underpainting. So I'm going to mix some colors. You'll see how I do it. I'm going to scoop off a little bit of color, just kind of off to the side a little bit. Now, you guys have 1 plate. I tried to get really big ones, but it might be helpful if you have some extra plates at home to do your color mixing on another plate, or clean off your paint palettes and use your ceramic paint palettes for this too. So I'm just going to get a tiny bit of black. I don't need a lot because I'm just making kind of a light shade of gray. And so I start by kind of swirling it around, and then you have to kind of scrape it off and then kind of smush it down. So kind of swirl it, scrape it a little bit. And I'm not mixing into the whole thing because I know I'm going to need white later, so I'm trying to just have just a little spot of color. And you don't need a lot for the underpainting. Just a little bit of that color will do just fine. And if it gets stuck onto your mixing tool, just grab a brush and kind of scoop that paint off, get it back on your plate. You don't want to waste any of the paint, so try and get as much of that extra off and onto your plate. And then whatever is left, you can just wipe with some paper towel. So hopefully if you got some paper towel at home, or an old rag, that would work too. Now the other thing that's important to know about oil painting is we really don't use a lot of water to clean up. And I'll kind of show you. So this brush, usually what I would do is wipe off all the extra paint that I can, and then I would wash it. But kind of as I paint with oil paint, I rarely clean the brushes unless I'm switching colors completely. So I've got a gray here. This will do for my mountains. Again, I'm using the straight blue for my sky, the darker green for my trees. And so now I'm gonna mix a little bit of a light green. So I'm gonna just take that same paint stick, flip around, use the other end. And so for this one, I want it to be a nice light spring green. So I'm gonna take a little bit of the yellow and a little bit of the green and kind of mix those together. So you can see I'm kind of scraping. This works for the edge of the plate. So this is probably darker than I want, so I'm gonna take just a tiny bit more yellow. Again, I don't wanna use too much because for the underpainting, the color does not have to be exact. All right, close enough. Another thing about oil painting is it's very sneaky. It gets on your hands, it kind of goes all over the place. It does clean up really well with soap and water, but as you can see, hopefully, I've got some scrap paper here, so please, please, please make sure that you are protecting your parents' surfaces by putting some newspaper, or if you have an old drop cloth, even an old t-shirt that you can lay down on your table, so that way you're not getting paint on anything. So I've got my colors. I'm gonna show you how we mix for the underpainting. So I've got a little cup of water, and again, the underpainting is the only time that we mix water with our oil paint. And so you'll see how I do that. So I'm gonna start, because I've got a little gray on my brush already, I'm gonna start with that one. So I get my brush wet, and right at the edge of my color, because I'm barely using any color at all, I'm going to start mixing some water. So I'm using a little bit of paint, but it's mostly water. So I'm gonna move my palette off to the side so you guys can see. And then I'm just brushing on a very thin coat. And usually one of the most common questions is, how do I know if it's thin enough? Well, you will know because you should still be able to see the pencil through your underpainting. So you can see the graphite from my pencil. And again, reminders, go all the way to the edges of your palette or of your canvas. It's gonna be blotchy, that is totally fine. Again, this is an underpainting. It's really meant to provide a little bit of depth of color and fill in the texture of the canvas, because pure, thick oil paint wouldn't take many layers to fill in this texture. So again, I've kind of used that up, so I'm gonna go back, get a little bit more water, add a tiny bit more, and paint this last mountain. All right, so I've got the underpainting done for my mountains, so now I'm gonna jump over to my trees. So this is again, one of the few times we're using water. The brushes don't have to be perfectly clean, just kind of rinse them out in a cup. Maybe find an older cup of your parents so you're not getting paint everywhere. So again, I'm mixing right at the edge of the paint. I don't wanna mix water directly into my big blob of paint, just right at the edge, because you only need a little bit of paint and mostly water. And again, it's okay if the colors overlap. It doesn't have to be perfect for this underpainting. You're really just trying to block in your main objects. All right, so the trees are done, and now I'm going to work on this grassy area. So I'm actually gonna switch to a bigger brush just to make things go a little faster. Remember, a common painting mistake is using the wrong size brush. So when you're doing larger areas, so this grassy area, and then when I get to the sky, I want to use a bigger brush. So some of this water is kind of mixing around it. It's totally fine. The paint will not absorb it unless I start trying to mix it in. So I can already tell this color is going to be way darker than what I really want for this field area. But again, for the underpainting, the color doesn't have to be perfect. We're really just trying to block it in and fill in all of the little white spots. And it's blending with the tree, but they're both green, so it doesn't really matter. And again, just as a reminder, when you are doing this underpainting, it needs to be thin enough that you can see your pencil lines. So if you are painting on your underpainting and you're losing your pencil lines, you probably need to add more water. But if it is really thin and you still can't see them, then maybe you just need to go back and darken those lines. So I'm gonna switch to my blue now. So I'm gonna clean out my brush, and I'm actually going to flip this around just to make it a little bit easier for myself. So again, I'm using that pure blue. Probably not the final color I'll be using, but good enough for this. So my brush still had a little bit of green on it, and that is totally fine. So I'm mixing that in. I'm holding my palette just so you guys can see. And so you can see there's still some green on my brush there, but again, because I'm really aiming to just tint the canvas, it's fine if there is a little bit of kind of stray color in there. Or if it's streaky or uneven for this underpainting, it doesn't really matter. Now when you start painting, you're not going to want to be moving your canvas around. So I highly recommend that you find a spot somewhere in your house where you can leave your painting where it won't get disturbed. So maybe away from pets or younger siblings, or if you have parents that like to overzealously clean your house, find a spot where you can leave it. Okay, so underpainting is done. It is thin, it is messy, it is streaky, and that is totally fine. Again, we are just trying to block in our colors, fill in the texture of our canvas, so that way we have a nice depth and tone, and we don't have to worry about little white spots showing through. So at this point, once the underpainting is done, and I do recommend that you do it in one sitting, as you can see, it doesn't take too long, but I recommend that you do it in one sitting, and then this needs to dry for 24 hours before you can start building up the layers of color. So once you get your underpainting done, take the rest of the day off. You will want to make sure that on your paint palette, take a little paper towel and soak up any extra water. You don't want your paint absorbing any water at this point, so just use a paper towel, or if you have some spare around the house, even a little toilet paper works. But soak up that extra water, and then you want to make sure that you wrap your paint up really tightly. So you want to make sure that you wrap up your paint really tightly in between your different painting sessions. So I like to kind of tap it down just so it touches each of the colors. Then I know that it's on there. Oil paint dries very slowly. It dries by oxidation instead of evaporation, so it's going to have a very slow drying time, but you want to prolong the life of your paint as long as possible. So make sure you wrap it up with some saran wrap to keep your paint from drying out, and this will be good to go. So this is, underpainting is going to dry for 24 hours. At this point, wash off any of your brushes. The best thing that you can use to clean your brushes at home, especially with oil paint, is liquid dish soap. So just squirt a little bit in your hand, rub it around. I also recommend that you put liquid dish soap on any stains. So if you accidentally get some oil paint on your clothing or on a surface that you're painting on, liquid dish soap is the best thing because it breaks down the oils. This particular oil paint is a school safe version, so it is water and soap cleanup rather than turpentine, which is what traditional oil paint is. So you can use some hand soap or some dish soap to get it cleaned up for in between painting sessions.